By the time the order reached the flight line, most of the men already sensed it was meant to be forgotten. The briefing carried none of the urgency usually reserved for decisive operations. Only a clip directive and a map marked with a sector few strategists still believed held real value. The patrol was labeled containment, a word that quietly translated into delay, observation, and survival if possible. Yet something in the timing felt wrong. Enemy radio chatter had shifted patterns, and supply convoys reported movements where none were expected. The mission sounded routine, but routine had been killing crews. Maintenance tents hummed with low generators and quiet frustration as ground crews worked through aircraft that should have been retired a year earlier. Hydraulic lines leaked despite careful sealing. Engine housings vibrated under test power, and replacement parts were scavenged from airframes already written off in inventory reports. Pilots moved between stations with habitual calm, touching metal surfaces, checking rivets, memorizing small imperfections that might grow into failures under combat strain. Nobody spoke openly about survival rates anymore. Instead, conversations circled weather forecasts, fuel mixture ratios, and runway debris, practical subjects that allowed concentration to replace fear, at least until command officers reviewed maps inside a reinforced operations room that smelled of damp paper and stale tobacco. Intelligence summaries repeated familiar phrases about enemy logistical exhaustion, yet fresh reconnaissance photographs showed new revetments carved into tree lines and vehicle tracks widening secondary roads. Senior staff avoided direct contradictions, instead labeling anomalies as temporary dispersal tactics. Still, resource allocations told a quieter truth. Fuel shipments to this sector had been reduced twice in 3 weeks, and replacement crews were being routed elsewhere. The air group scheduled for containment patrol now represented a line of defense that higher command expected to bend. The pilots understood these signals without needing confirmation. Many had transferred from units that no longer existed. Their original squadrons dissolved after catastrophic losses during previous offensives. They carried habits formed under constant retreat. Fuel conservation instincts, defensive formation spacing, and acceptance that mission objectives often shifted midair. In quiet moments before takeoff, some reread old letters folded inside navigation cases. Not for comfort, but for grounding, reminders of lives defined by seasons instead of sorties. The airfield itself felt temporary, built on flattened farmland where winter mud still swallowed vehicle tires along the taxi routes during early morning. Weather reports predicted low cloud cover by late afternoon, with intermittent breaks that would create dangerous sun glare at altitude. Such conditions favor experienced navigators, but complicated coordinated formations, especially for mixed aircraft performance groups. The assigned patrol required long-range fuel settings, limiting maneuver time if unexpected engagements developed. Armament crews loaded ammunition belts slowly, checking for corrosion along feed links, knowing jams under stress were as deadly as enemy fire. Each aircraft received slightly different adjustments, unofficial modifications that balanced aging engines against mission range. The result was a formation united by purpose but divided by subtle mechanical limitations. Briefing concluded without ceremony. Flight leaders received final radio frequencies, fallback rally coordinates, and updated recognition signals meant to reduce friendly fire risks in poor visibility. The operations officer spoke evenly, neither optimistic nor fatalistic, presenting data like a technician reading maintenance logs. When dismissal came, chairs scraped quietly and men moved with efficient purpose, conserving energy even in routine gestures. Outside, engines coughed to life one by one, propeller wash sending dust spiraling across the apron. The sound created a physical pressure in the chest, a vibration felt through boots and bone, erasing abstract strategy and replacing it with. Taxi procedures stretched longer than normal because several aircraft required staggered power increases to prevent engine overheating. Controllers monitored oil pressure reports with unusual intensity, clearing departures only after extended idle cycles. One by one, the fighters lifted into pale morning light, wheels retracting slowly as if reluctant to leave stable ground. Formation assembly occurred above scattered cloud layers, where sunlight reflected sharply off metal wings and canopy glass. Radio discipline remained tight, limited to position confirmations and fuel state updates. Beneath the formation, The landscape unfolded in muted winter colors, villages and fields appearing peaceful despite the invisible networks. Initial patrol segments showed nothing unusual. Scheduled checkpoints passed on time, and radar controllers reported routine sweeps with minor interference. Yet subtle irregularities emerged through experience rather than instruments. Civilian road traffic appeared thinner than expected. Smoke columns from industrial zones burned at reduced output, and river barge movement had shifted to night cycles. These signs suggested deliberate operational concealment rather than supply shortage. The patrol commander logged observations carefully, transmitting coded summaries for later analysis. The mission still resembled containment on paper, but in practice it felt like drifting along the edge of something reorganizing just beyond visual range. Fuel calculations forced the formation to widen spacing, reducing mutual defensive coverage but extending overall patrol duration. The decision reflected training doctrine shaped by losses, endurance over aggression, observation over pursuit. Some pilots felt the familiar tension of restraint, watching distant contrails without authority to engage. Sunlight intensified above cloud breaks, causing momentary blindness during banking turns. Cockpit temperatures fluctuated sharply between solar heat and external cold, creating condensation along instrument glass. These physical discomforts accumulated, draining concentration slowly. War, at this stage, felt less like dramatic combat and more like sustained exposure to mechanical stress, fatigue, and the constant. By the time the patrol reached its final observation leg, the crews had settled into the emotional rhythm that defined survival on this front. Alert but detached, disciplined but quietly resigned. No single moment suggested significance, yet the accumulation of anomalies lingered in thought. Reports would be filed, archived, and perhaps ignored depending on priorities elsewhere. For now, the mission fulfilled its official purpose, maintaining presence in a sector others consider strategically expendable. The pilots turned toward home airspace with methodical precision, carry with them the uneasy sense that history sometimes shifted not through decisive battles, but through small operations. Morning reconnaissance reports arrived with subtle discrepancies that most analysts initially dismissed as routine equipment drift. Yet operators who had tracked the same sector for months felt an instinctive unease as new radar echoes appeared at irregular intervals, often vanishing before confirmation sweeps could verify them. Flight schedules intercepted from coded transmissions showed departures occurring earlier than established patterns, suggesting crews were repositioning rather than rotating. In briefing rooms, intelligence officers marked these details in pencil rather than ink, signaling uncertainty without formal alarm. The war had trained everyone to respect small inconsistencies, because entire offensives had once begun with. Ground crews noticed operational tempo increasing in ways that official schedules did not acknowledge. Aircraft returning from patrol were refueled immediately instead of waiting standard cooling intervals, and maintenance shifts extended quietly into night hours without written orders. Toolkits remained open beside engine housings as mechanics improvised repairs using salvaged components, prioritizing reliability over regulation. The smell of heated oil and solvent lingered constantly across hangar floors, mixing with damp winter air. Nobody complained openly. The adjustments felt like preparation rather than reaction. Experience taught them that equipment readiness often predicted strategic developments before any communique reached frontline units. Airfield controllers experienced growing pressure as radar stations requested more frequent verification checks, forcing communication channels to remain saturated for longer periods. Static interference, once occasional, now pulsed through headsets during peak monitoring hours, requiring constant signal adjustments. Some operators developed headaches from prolonged concentration, but staffing shortages prevented rotation. The radar screens themselves showed faint, transient shapes at altitudes previously in use by enemy patrols. Technical teams recalibrated receivers repeatedly, yet the anomalies persisted. The data did not indicate direct threat, but it complicated prediction models, forcing planners to consider possibilities that stretch beyond standard defensive doctrine of modern warfare. Pilots felt the change most clearly in mission scheduling. Rest cycles shortened by small increments that seemed insignificant individually, but accumulated into persistent fatigue. Navigation briefings added supplementary pages listing alternate routes and emergency landing strips across increasingly wide territories. Weather officers expanded forecast windows to include microclimate predictions near river valleys and industrial smoke zones, indicating planners expected operations to stretch into unfamiliar conditions. Conversations in ready rooms grew quieter, focused on checklists rather than speculation. Each man since command was widening its defensive lens, preparing for operational patterns that no longer followed predictable geographic or temporal boundaries anymore. Logistics officers began tracking fuel reserves with greater urgency, calculating distribution scenarios based on hypothetical surge operations rather than current usage rates. Supply convoys were rerouted through secondary roads to reduce visibility, increasing travel time but lowering detection risk. Depot managers received coded directives emphasizing dispersion of ammunition storage, a tactic typically reserved for sectors expecting heavy aerial targeting. Clerks processed paperwork without comment, but the volume of revisions signaled strategic recalibration. Even small airstrips received emergency stock allocations. The movement of resources suggested leadership was quietly reinforcing areas once labeled low priority, reflecting shifting threat assessments across the broader. Field hospitals noticed casualty transfer patterns changing subtly. Instead of concentrated surges after major engagements, wounded personnel arrived in smaller, but more frequent groups, often from reconnaissance skirmishes or mechanical incidents during high-tempo sorties. Medical officers interpreted this as evidence of increased operational testing along multiple fronts simultaneously. Supply requisitions for blood plasma and surgical instruments rose modestly but consistently. Ambulance crews reported longer driving distances between pickup points, suggesting dispersed contact zones. The medical system adapted quietly, expanding triage capacity without public acknowledgement, mirroring how military institutions often prepare for escalation through administrative shifts rather than dramatic announcements alone. Signals intelligence units intercepted increasing volumes of short-duration, encrypted transmissions, many too brief to decode fully, but numerous enough to indicate heightened coordination. Analysts charted transmission origin points and discovered emerging clusters along transport corridors previously considered secondary. The pattern suggested preparation for rapid movement rather than static defense. Communication specialists worked extended rotations, their eyes strained by oscillating signal graphs. Coffee ration allocations doubled unofficially within monitoring stations. Though official summaries remained cautious, internal memoranda began using language that implied potential operational expansion. The psychological weight of anticipation spread through technical staff who rarely experienced direct combat yet understood. Senior command began requesting scenario simulations from planning divisions that incorporated worst-case assumptions previously considered unlikely. War games introduced enemy multi-axis air operations, synchronized with electronic interference, and rapid ground reinforcement. Younger staff officers initially treated these exercises as theoretical extremes, but veterans recognized them as preparation templates. Planning rooms filled with map overlays showing overlapping operational radii. Colored pins multiplied across boards representing supply nodes, airfields, and transport hubs. The visual density alone signaled expanded strategic concern. Meetings lengthened as commanders debated resource prioritization, balancing immediate frontline stability against the risk of sudden concentrated enemy breakthroughs elsewhere across sectors. Within individual squadrons, morale settled into a pragmatic steadiness shaped by accumulated experience. Pilots exchanged maintenance tips and navigation shortcuts more often than stories of past victories. The culture emphasized endurance, precision, and mutual support over heroics. Letters from home were read during brief, quiet intervals, folded carefully back into flight suits before pre-mission checks resumed. Each routine action became ritualized, providing psychological structure against uncertainty. The men no longer expected clear turning points in the war, only gradual shifts measured through operational pressure. This mindset allowed them to function effectively despite growing awareness that strategic stability was becoming increasingly. Across the theater, these small signals accumulated into a quiet but undeniable narrative of transformation. No single report justified alarm, yet together they describe an opponent adjusting doctrine, logistics, and tempo simultaneously. The effect on command psychology was gradual but profound. Confidence in existing intelligence models weakened, replaced by cautious flexibility. Orators began including contingency language once considered unnecessary. The war was shifting shape, not through sudden visible offensives, but through coordinated preparation unfolding beneath observation thresholds. Those living inside the system sensed the change first, long before history would record the moment as the beginning of a larger strategic. Night operations always carried a different emotional weight. But this particular shift began with an unusual calm that settled across radar rooms and flight lines alike. Technicians monitored familiar green arcs sweeping across screens, logging routine returns from friendly patrols and distant civilian transport corridors. The air outside felt heavy with late winter moisture, muting sound and blurring distant lights along the perimeter fencing. Inside control stations, coffee cooled untouched as operators leaned closer to scopes, adjusting gain levels to compensate for intermittent atmospheric distortion. Nothing indicated crisis, yet the volume of coordination requests from neighboring sectors created subtle tension. Radio verification checks began arriving out of sequence, forcing controllers to repeat identification calls and cross-reference transponder codes manually. The delay was minor at first, measured in seconds, but seconds in air defense networks carried disproportionate importance. Adjacent radar stations reported intermittent power fluctuations, blamed initially on generator fuel impurities or worn relay contacts. Technical teams moved quickly, replacing components with practice efficiency, yet the interruptions continued in irregular cycles. Senior duty officers exchanged quiet glances, marking incident times on shared logs. The pattern did not match known enemy jamming signatures, nor did it resemble equipment fatigue, emerging quietly. By midnight, several radar arrays along the outer grid reported total signal dropout, lasting up to 30 seconds before restoring without operator input. Backup channels activated automatically, yet data lag created gaps in tracking continuity that controllers could not reconstruct. Air Defense Command Centers began requesting manual observation confirmation from searchlight units and coastal listening posts. Telephone circuits overloaded as simultaneous verification calls crossed regional boundaries. The sense of network reliability, built through years of refinement, began eroding in real time. Operators spoke less, focusing on disciplined procedure, aware that confusion spread fastest when communication clarity broke under technical strain. Interception flights already airborne received fragmented updates, forcing navigators to rely on dead reckoning calculations rather than real-time vector corrections. Cloud cover thickened across the sector, reflecting moonlight into diffuse glare that complicated horizon perception. Pilots adjusted instrument lighting to reduce cockpit reflection, scanning gauges with deliberate patience. Formation spacing widened as radio clarity degraded, each aircraft becoming a partially isolated unit, sharing only essential transmissions. Training emphasized autonomy under system failure, yet applying those lessons in operational darkness demanded intense mental discipline. Every engine vibration, every minor instrument fluctuation gained psychological significance as crews measured survival through technical. Ground command struggled to assemble a coherent operational picture as situation boards filled with delayed position markers and estimated tracks. Duty analysts began sketching probable flight corridors using grease pencils, compensating for missing digital confirmations. Runners carried printed updates between rooms when internal messaging systems slowed under load. The command environment shifted from predictive control to reactive management, a psychological transition officers were trained to avoid but forced to accept. Decisions required faster authorization, despite reduced information quality. The realization spread quietly that defensive coordination was now depending on individual judgment across dozens of disconnected points, rather than centralized control. Within maintenance hangars, crews prepared additional aircraft for immediate launch despite incomplete diagnostic cycles. Safety margins narrowed intentionally, reflecting wartime necessity over peacetime procedure. Mechanics listened to engines with trained ears, identifying acceptable irregularities versus catastrophic warning signs. Spare radios were installed hastily, wiring routed along temporary brackets and secured with improvised insulation. The smell of overheated insulation mixed with aviation fuel vapors, creating an environment of constant low-level nausea. Yet work continued steadily, driven by collective understanding that operational air presence now depended less on perfect machinery and more on keeping enough aircraft airborne to maintain defensive visibility. Meanwhile, intelligence liaison officers attempted to reconcile field reports with incomplete radar archives, building layered probability charts instead of confirmed threat vectors. The analytical process slowed decision-making, yet abandoning analysis entirely risked misdirecting limited resources. Some senior commanders authorized localized autonomy, allowing sector leaders to respond according to immediate perception rather than awaiting full confirmation. This shift redistributed psychological burden downward through the command hierarchy. Junior officers found themselves making decisions with strategic consequences, balancing caution against urgency. The war's technological infrastructure had promised clarity, yet its temporary collapse exposed how heavily modern operations relied on human judgment stress. The airborne unit assigned to containment patrol found itself positioned closer to emerging blind zones than any reserve formation. Their radar updates faded completely during one verification cycle, leaving only last known coordinates and fuel projections. Flight leaders reviewed contingency procedures mentally, prioritizing observation and reporting over engagement unless directly threatened. The absence of guidance created unusual emotional silence across radio channels. Each pilot understood the collective responsibility now resting on their ability to interpret fragmentary visual cues. War, in this moment, reduced itself to individual sight lines through canopy glass and the reliability of personal training against systemic uncertainty. As ground-based radar coverage degraded further, coastal observers and listening stations became primary early warning assets. Reports arrived through voice transmission, often delayed by weather interference or line congestion. These human-sourced observations lacked precise altitude data, but provided general movement direction, forcing airborne units to estimate intercept feasibility based on fuel and position. Command channels encouraged conservative maneuvering, preserving aircraft presence over aggressive pursuit. The strategy reflected acceptance that maintaining surveillance continuity mattered more than scoring tactical victories. For the crews in the air, this translated into long stretches of careful scanning, punctuated by brief moments of strain. By the final hours before dawn, command networks operated in a fragile equilibrium, sustained by improvisation and disciplined restraint. No single failure point explained the disruption. Instead, cumulative technical strain had reshaped the battlefield into fragmented perception zones. Officers documented every anomaly carefully, aware future analysis would depend on surviving records. Crews in air and ground positions adapted to the new reality without dramatic declaration, continuing duties with practiced professionalism. The system had not completely collapsed, but its reliability had been fundamentally shaken. The experience reinforced a lesson repeated throughout the war. When systems fail, responsibility returns to individuals adapt. Dawn approached slowly over fractured defense network, revealing how much coordination had already shifted from centralized command to isolated crews interpreting partial data through instinct and training. The airborne unit adjusted formation spacing to maximize visual coverage, accepting greater personal risk to maintain a continuous observation screen across vulnerable. Inside each cockpit, instrument lights glowed dim amber, reflecting from scratched glass panels while pilots balanced fuel economy against maneuver readiness. Their decisions now carried strategic weight, because every aircraft remaining airborne represented both reconnaissance capacity and a psychological signal that defensive presence had not completely dissolved yet anywhere today. Below them, scattered searchlight units swept cautiously across cloud layers, coordinating by voice radio with coastal observers who estimated direction by sound and silhouette. This imperfect system demanded patience, forcing air crews to trust human reports instead of precise electronic vectors, transforming air defense into something closer to earlier wartime improvisation. Command posts attempted to rebuild regional awareness through manual plotting, layering pencil estimates over fading radar histories. Officers compared timing intervals between observer calls, constructing moving corridors of probability rather than confirmed tracks. The work required intense concentration, as small mathematical errors could redirect scarce aircraft toward empty sky open. Fuel gauges slowly declined toward pre-calculated minimums, forcing flight leaders to evaluate how long they could sustain patrol geometry without jeopardizing safe return. The calculation blended arithmetic with instinct, weighing survival of individual crews against preservation of the defensive barrier, protecting ground infrastructure, and retreating supply convoys moving inland. When scattered hostile aircraft finally appeared at extreme visual range, interception choices required rapid commitment despite incomplete intelligence. Pilots coordinated through brief coded transmissions, closing distance cautiously to avoid ambush formations possibly hidden inside cloud layers. The engagement that followed remained fragmented, consisting of short firing passes and evasive repositioning. No single confrontation delivered decisive tactical results, yet the persistent presence of defending aircraft disrupted enemy movement timing. Bombers altered course, escorts tightened formations prematurely, and reconnaissance elements withdrew earlier than planned. The cumulative effect reduced penetration depth, buying critical minutes for ground command to redistribute anti-aircraft resources along corridors. Ground units listening to distant engine noise interpreted altitude and speed by experience, relaying estimates that helped air patrols anticipate approach vectors. This cooperation between air and ground personnel restored fragments of operational cohesion, demonstrating how layered observation networks could compensate temporarily when technological systems lost reliability under sustained pressure. Inside command bunkers, officers began issuing decentralized authority orders, allowing local controllers to redirect aircraft without higher clearance. The policy carried risk of misallocation, but prevented paralysis caused by waiting for incomplete strategic confirmation. War planning doctrine had always included such contingencies, yet rarely had they been implemented across area. For the pilots maintained patrol loops, time lost conventional meaning, replaced by fuel calculations, engine vibration interpretation, and horizon scanning. Fatigue pressed against concentration, yet training routines preserved functional clarity. Each successful radio check with another friendly aircraft provided brief reassurance that collective defense still existed beyond isolation of cockpits. Weather conditions gradually improved after sunrise, revealing contrail patterns stretching across sectors previously hidden by darkness. Intelligence officers later used these visual traces to reconstruct approximate flight volumes, validating field observations gathered during system disruption. The evidence confirmed that defensive persistence, rather than technical superiority, had limited enemy freedom during. Maintenance crews prepared returning aircraft with exhausted efficiency, documenting damage while engines still ticked with cooling heat. Their reports revealed stress fractures, ammunition depletion, and improvised wiring fatigue. Yet most airframes remained serviceable, allowing commanders to rebuild a defensive rotation faster than enemy planners likely anticipated from intelligence-gathered engagement. Medical stations treated returning aircrew for dehydration, oxygen fatigue, and minor frost exposure, recording physiological strain data that later influenced flight duration protocols. Doctors understood that preserving pilot endurance was strategically equal to preserving aircraft. Quiet clinical routines thus became part of the broader defensive recovery effort stabilizing the sector. Intelligence divisions compiled overnight anomaly logs into comprehensive operational reviews, identifying how simultaneous minor disruptions could produce cascading network instability. The analysis shifted strategic thinking away from reliance on single technology solutions toward layered redundancy. Lessons from the event were quietly distributed through classified doctrine revisions across multiple commands worldwide. For the squadron itself, the mission concluded without ceremony, recorded simply as extended defensive patrol with limited engagement success. Yet, veterans recognized its significance immediately. They had prevented operational blindness from becoming territorial collapse. The response manifested not in celebration, but in collective relief expressed through maintenance checks and moments. Historians would later categorize the action as a stabilizing engagement rather than a decisive battle. Yet archival data showed its timing prevented synchronized enemy operations across multiple sectors. Such outcomes rarely produce medals or headlines, but they preserve strategic continuity, allowing larger defensive structures to adapt rather than fracture pressure. The experience reinforced a recurring wartime truth that infrastructure, no matter how advanced, ultimately relied on human adaptability. Training programs afterward emphasized independent decision-making, sensory observation skills, and cross-discipline communication. The Knights' lessons became embedded within institutional memory, shaping defensive doctrine long after the conflict ended permanently thereafter. Surviving participants rarely spoke dramatically about the operation, describing it instead as exhausting work performed under imperfect information. Their modest accounts, when later compared against operational archives, reveal how close the defensive network had come to systemic fragmentation. Professional understatement often concealed moments where entire campaigns balanced on ordinary decisions. Strategically, the engagement demonstrated that maintaining observation continuity could deny an opponent the confidence required for deep penetration. By forcing uncertainty into enemy planning cycles, even limited defensive forces could reshape operational tempo. This principle influenced later air defense integration strategies combining technology, human observation, and decentralized authority structures effectively. As records from that period entered historical archives, analysts recognized the mission as a hinge moment where structure survived disruption. The defense network endured not because systems functioned perfectly, but because individuals adapted quickly enough to preserve collective capability, ensuring the broader campaign retained operational coherence during its transition stable.